the Kapiti region, Hector immersed himself in the intricate web of Maori alliances and trade. Crossing paths with Te Ro Paraha, who had taken over the Kapiti island, making it his stronghold. Although the strategic marriage had helped Hector integrate into society, life for him in Te Kopi was not without its challenges. Te Kopi Natera was a woman of mana and high rank, who saw their marriage as a way to strengthen her people's position within the changing landscape. Her union with Hector brought mutual benefit, intertwining their worlds in trade and alliances. The loss of Te Kopi in childbirth was a devastating blow. Though grief-stricken, Hector was determined to raise their son with the values instilled by his union to Te Kopi and uphold the alliances he had built, continuing to earn trust and respect of local iwi.
It wasn't her choice to be given, but certainly she could have looked at it as an opportunity for the betterment of her people. If her uncle Te Rauparaha said, "This is for you," then obviously that was going to be for her. I guess she was a woman of high rank, and she would have had the mana and prestige that goes with that rank. She would have done her best and given the marriage everything that she possibly could have done. Meeting a foreigner that was to be her husband, that was to be the father of their offspring, the mana and the woman would have carried her into that next phase of her life. Moving from the whānau warmth, aroha, then having to build the relationship with Hector was a challenge. Let's be honest, any relationship is a challenge. For them to have a son in Hugh Victor was probably the most precious thing she could have given not only her new husband and Hector, but also to her iwi as well. Unfortunately, it has been recorded, Te Kopi died giving birth to their son. Not a lot is really known about him. By all accounts, he was a strong Māori baby, and to be honest, surviving childbirth and coming into this world for young babies of that time was fraught with danger. They didn't have the maternity care, obviously, back in those days. With the passing of his mother, Hector raised him in his first 4 or 5 years. That care would have been shared by his mother's whānau, and he would have been subjected to Māori life as well. So he would have been not accomplished but comfortable in Te Ao Māori, but also comfortable in Te Ao Pākehā as well. When Hector was to meet his second wife, Agnes Carmont, Agnes raised Hugh as one of her own, and he became the oldest of the siblings that were to follow with Hector and Agnes.
By the 1840s, a whaling industry that had brought wealth and industry to Kapiti Island was on the verge of collapse. Hector established trading stores, supplying the region with goods that were difficult to obtain. He was not just a trader, he was a bridge between two economies. He understood the value of relationships, forging strong ties with the iwi who saw trade as a pathway to prosperity in a rapidly changing world.
There's lots of examples of settlers like MacDonald entering into leases with leaders of Māori communities. They would have required, I think, a degree of established mutual respect. The settler coming in would have had to make his good faith clear. The rangatira themselves involved in the arrangements clearly expected to benefit. They would have expected a degree of respect for tikanga, for custom, and often too those relationships were confirmed by marriage and by other relationships like that. But after the signing of Te Tiriti o Waitangi in 1840, the legal position became very difficult. Article 2 in English of the treaty includes the provision that the Crown had the sole right to purchase land from Māori. Whatever might be said about that, very quickly colonial governments started saying that that also meant that iwi and hapu had no right to lease land on their own account to settlers. Now, whatever the merits of that argument, that was enforced in some parts of the country as a way of pressuring hapu to sell land to the Crown. As for the relationships with Māoris, that's always a very interesting question, and I think in MacDonald's case, eventually he ended up leasing a very large area from local Māori, from Ngāti Raukawa and Muupoko. Their expectations naturally were material benefit and perhaps also having a relationship with part of the new society as well. How you think about that in class terms is really interesting indeed. I think the critical issue for Māori, hapu, iwi up and down the country is to maintain their independence in the context of this new wave of settlement, and many of their leaders had to think very strategically about that. So for them it was about, I think, maintaining relationships that were of material benefit, but perhaps also of a link to what was coming in as a new way of life, a new order, whether they liked it or not in the end. Challenges were establishing yourself in a new place where the infrastructure that they might have been used to was pretty much non-existent. Especially in the 1830s and 40s, it was a very rough and ready existence. Our settlers tried to introduce some of the comforts of home as best they could, but they were also prepared, I think, to put up with a good deal of what we now regard as fairly basic conditions. But on the other hand, especially before 1840, they were dependent upon Māori. They needed to maintain good relationships with Māori. They would often be leasing land from Māori. They'd be acting as middlemen for Māori-produced goods, pigs, potatoes, flax, that sort of thing. And often those relationships too were tied up with marriage or other relationships of that nature as well.
The signing of Te Tiriti o Waitangi in 1840 significantly impacted relationships between Māori and European settlers across Aotearoa, including the Horowhenua region. While the treaty promised to establish a framework for coexistence, protect Māori rights and regulate European settlement, its interpretation led to profound changes in the dynamics between Māori and Pākehā. Christianity was sold as a powerful new knowledge, offering access to the written world, new tools for survival and alliances in a rapidly shifting world. But the spread of different Christian denominations also divided hapu and iwi as competing beliefs took hold. Where once spiritual unity was guided by the wisdom of Tohunga, now the presence of Anglicans, Catholics and Methodists introduced new tensions, both within communities and between them.
So Anglicans, missionaries like Octavius Hadfield, whose strong relationships with Ngāti Raukawa and Ngāti Toa, he has fought against the government over the Waitara, has fought against the government over confiscation of Māori land, but he feels they're just not being listened to. The government is rejecting the Treaty of Waitangi and its promises. But he also fears as an Anglican that Māori are losing faith in Anglicanism, because Anglicanism has always been a kind of a triumvirate, Māori, the Church and the Crown. And he has discredited the Crown, or the Crown has discredited himself, and he has attacked the Crown. So Māori faith in the Crown in this area is being severely eroded, and it will also be eroded in the Anglican Church.
There can be little doubt that by the 1840s, Māori culture was using Christianity as a significant route in order to find ways of development, of modernisation, and of finding new spiritual aspirations. So when you look at, for example, the great church of Rangiatia with its 3 mighty big poles in the middle that hold up this enormous roof, you can see that in the way in which they interpret that and the symbolism which they see in it, that they're drawing on an interesting and rich repertoire of Māori tradition and Christian tradition in order to weave a way in which the old and the new will come together. There's a spiritual connection that they find in the cultures, and certainly if you look at the carvings in what may seem in Rangiatia a very plain church, but nevertheless does have some use of carving, and in Pukearika, in contrast, because the Catholic missionaries were far more willing to accommodate the use of Māori iconography, there is a kind of real richness of use of Māori traditional arts and crafts being woven together in the culture of the church. So I don't think we should imagine these traditions by this stage are in sharp contrast with each other.
With Aotearoa undergoing significant cultural and religious changes, Hector and Agnes moved to the mouth of the Hokio stream. It was here he built the accommodation house for the passengers and workers on the Cobb & Co coaches, who plied their services along the beachfront. He built a granary, stables for coaches and horses, and even had a liquor licence. This establishment became the connecting link between travellers and Māori for the next 10 years. Agnes positioned herself as the local medic, nursing and providing aid to Māori despite being the only white woman for miles around. With a determination and resilience of her own, she strove to reduce the high mortality rate in the Māori community.
Scottish people, as we know, are known to be of tough demeanour. Agnes was no different. She came into a Māori world not knowing what to expect, but by all accounts she bore 10 children to Hector. She immersed herself in the community and the business ventures that Hector was involved in. By all accounts she had some medical experience, and she helped alleviate diseases that a lot of our Māori people were going through at the time. I think this stood her in good stead with not only her peers but the Māori community as well. And given the tough times that were around at that time, not only social pressures but economic pressures as well, Agnes Carmont was a very, very strong woman.
For Māori particularly, Agnes was able to address some of the European diseases that had come in with settlers, things that caused death to Loikawiwi, because they're diseases that they had never had to deal with before. And one of those particularly that she dealt with was scrofula, which is an infection in the lymph nodes in the neck. And if not treated, people would die of it. And Māori were very whakamā if they had it, and basically took themselves away out of sight, not to be seen, because they knew that it would result in death. Agnes knew that from her work in the dispensary that iodine could cure that, and so she was pretty much of a zealot. She'd go in onto the maraes, make sure she found the people who had it, whether they want to be found or not, and treat them. I think it was pretty shameful at the time, but it saved their lives.
Hector and latterly Agnes both spoke fluent Te Reo Māori. They came in speaking Scott Gaelic as opposed to English. Coming in and learning a new language with those cultural parallels was perhaps a little more easy than it would have been for those coming in from England and learning it, because they didn't necessarily have those similarities in cultural frames. And I think that put them in really good stead for forming those relationships, because they could pick up the language more easily. And they certainly shared that on with their own children. And they maintained the Scottish Gaelic right up until my grandmother's generation. She talks about remembering her mum speaking in fluent Gaelic at home. However, that has not gone further down the generations. So now we're in a process of reclaiming that as well.
In settler communities like Hector and Agnes MacDonald's, cooperation was essential. People had to work together. There wasn't any room for individualism. We know too that Agnes was widely renowned for her assistance to Māori families with medical care. But more generally, people cooperated in harvest, in shearing, in anything that needed to be done. Be your turn one week, somebody else's turn the next.
I think Agnes must have been a pretty staunch wahine, to be honest. We speak of her as having traits carried down through the generations of that nurturing, caring side, but also that tenacity to stand on her own feet, so that strength of character that comes through, to be able to navigate different situations and maybe challenging situations, but still finding a space where nurturing can occur and that wellness can be enhanced, working with others and alongside of others.
Hector spent decades adapting to an ever-changing world, first as a whaler, then as a trader, and now as an innkeeper, provider and entrepreneur. In the Hokio settlement, he and Agnes carved out a life on the frontier where Māori and Pākehā, settlers and travellers, all crossed paths in a place of hospitality, trade and community. Despite being such a stabilising force in their community, it was inevitable that Hector and Agnes would soon get caught up in the ongoing land disputes. As tensions rose over leases and questions who is the legal and rightful owners of thousands of acres of land, the life they had worked hard for would soon be pushed to the limits. A potential conflict between local iwi and European settlers threatens to destroy everything Hector and Agnes have built.
So when the Crown arrives here in 1840, it wants to buy land. That's the whole point. It wants to buy land to make available to European settlers. There's a real debate about whether Māori own it or not, but we'll push that to one side. In buying land, it often wants to buy a block of land. Initially, it's not too worried about the boundaries because it can't afford survey. A survey is expensive. It just wants a block of land. It wants to extinguish Aboriginal title and put settlers on the land. The problem is, almost always when it does this, the people who it sells to are only one of the people who have a relationship with that land, and someone else turns up and says, "Why have you bought that land off them? We have interests." And it's impossible for the Crown to actually close off that and say, no one else has any interests in this land. We've bought it. So these layered sales take place. The Manawatu and Horowhenua has not been an area of great interest by anybody in the 1840s and 50s because the settlement of Whanganui and Wellington. Foxton, Otaki has become a major little settlement. But by the 40s and 1850s, there's much more interest taking place. And Europeans come in and negotiate large leaseholds, thousands of acres. Now, these leases are not formally illegal. They've actually been outlawed in the 1840s. The last thing the government wants is Māori getting a reasonable income off leasing land because that's going to make them reluctant to sell. So around Otaki, a number of European entrepreneurs are setting up their shops and their businesses. And Ngāti Raukawa will start doing this even before the court, of working out who's going to be the owners of that. Really conscious that this is a different way of looking at and dealing with land, but always fundamentally firm in the belief that the court is going to recognise their story and their title and their ownership to that land. The problem is, in cutting the land up into pieces, in dividing it all up, in allocating owners, it's also cutting up whakapapa. It's also saying this land exists according to this whakapapa, but not that whakapapa. And those leases are reasonably lucrative, and they're pan-tribal leases. But they also start raising questions that go back to these early peace agreements. Who has the right to negotiate the lease? How's the money going to be divided? And in the early 1860s, these become a source of quite severe conflict to the extent that muskets are being pulled out again. But remember, the 1860s are also a time of warfare, of conflict, of confiscation, new religious experiments occurring. So it's actually a time when the country is really seriously divided, and not just in the Māori world. So someone like Hector MacDonald, who's existed in that pre-1840 Māori world that's based on negotiations with iwi, is sitting by the 1850s, 60s and 70s, still using those negotiations to create leases with the different groups that he needs to work with. But the whole regime in which he's operated, in the same way that the regime before 1840, is now being replaced and being cast aside. He's going to find the increasing tensions between Mōpoko and Raukawa increasingly difficult for him to maintain a balance between his relationships between the two groups. So what happens in 1863 is that a major government official, Dr. Isaac Featherston, a politician, goes north to deal with a conflict over leases between Ngāti Apa and Raukawa, where people are reaching for their guns. And he has a solution. Crown will buy the land. You can have reserves, you'll get different reserves, there'll be no conflict. And there's been a major attempt in this whole period to start acquiring big amounts of land. Politically, not for small settlers, but for the elite who are setting themselves up in large landed estates across Hawke's Bay and Wairarapa in this period from earlier purchases. That purchase becomes extremely divisive. We often think that colonisation is about changing culture and warfare and the sorry history that we have of warfare and such conflict. But mostly it's about law. It's about the introduction of a foreign form of law, particularly land law, on a customary world that sees land, people, very, very differently from the way that is managed, traded, and organised under a title system that the English have evolved over generation upon generation. And I say English because it's English law rather than British law that is brought to New Zealand. Europeans coming to New Zealand did not want any of that. They're existing in a capitalist world of the mid-19th century where title and property need to be fundamentally the same. And it's one of the reasons New Zealand will opt for a Torrens system of title in the 1870s, which is a much clearly defined system of title. It couldn't vary more so than Māori relationships with land. It's even difficult to use the term ownership of land because it's really about relationships between land and people, between the past and the present. The histories, the whakapapa of that land are a system of title, and those are extremely fluid. As you move across the land, then the whakapapa of that land changes.
In 1865, as the Crown tightened its grip on New Zealand, the Māori Land Court under the Native Lands Act was established. Its stated purpose was to convert Māori communal land ownership into individual titles, bringing it in line with the British property law. But beneath this legal framework lay a deeper ambition, one that would have devastating consequences for Māori sovereignty and whenua.
While there's often a statement that Māori land is about boundaries, people know their boundaries, we shouldn't think of those boundaries in European terms as a surveyed block. These are particular pieces on the land that are remembered, that mean something important, but often are contingent and are about significant things. To drive a line between people and say, people on this line have this whakapapa and the people on that line have another whakapapa is extremely rare. In most cases, as you went from kāinga to kāinga, you drew on the different whakapapa relationships that brought you into that space.